you very much. Thank you very much, Mr. Martineau, for this very interesting presentation. First of all, I'd like to thank the European Values for taking the initiative of organizing today's conference on Islamic State and counter-radicalization. I'm glad to have an opportunity to share France's view on such complex and sensitive issues for many countries in Europe and beyond. I would like to make one preliminary remark. When talking about the Islamic State, I'd rather use the Arabic acronym Daesh, since it is not a state and has none of the prerogatives we associate to this notion, and also because it does not represent Islam. The phenomenon of the so-called foreign fighters concerns indeed not only Europe, but also Northern America and countries of the South, in particular in Northern Africa or other. France is among the countries particularly affected and must face a growing trend, in particular since the beginning of this year. Many figures have already been mentioned. They help us to understand the extent of the problem we have to tackle. Foreign fighters coming from more than 90 countries make up around 10% of Daesh fighters, and the number of European volunteers, as estimated by Europol, we just heard it, ranges from 3,000 to 5,000 people. According to the French Ministry of Interior, which keeps regularly updated statistics, in July 2015, over 1,800 French citizens or foreign residents in France, including over 200 women and children, were in a way or another involved in the Iraqi-Syrian branches of Daesh, an increase by more than 200% since January 2014. Among these people, 470 were actually present in Syria and in Iraq. 320 are thought to be on their way to jihad. 520 French radicals intend to leave for Syria or Iraq. 99 were killed, including 7 in suicide bombings, and 213 have returned to France. The average age ranges from 15 to 25 years old. Facing this phenomenon, we must try to understand the profile of radicalized young people who end up fighting in the ranks of Daesh. The first observation is the diversity of their profiles, which I think is a constant feature among the foreign fighters, whatever the country of origin. But there is often a common element. They are mostly disenfranchised young people who have failed and are in search of meaning or identity. The causes of such a situation have been well described. The breakdown of family structure, including the loss of paternal authority, the diminished influence of traditional institutional authorities with a key integrative role as the army, with the end of conscription, which ensured a social mix, or the educative system, the rising youth unemployment, the breakdown of the social ladder, the ghettoization of some neighborhoods, etc. But some young radicalized people can sometimes show very different profiles with no initial connection with Islam and growing up in traditional middle-class family. More than on religion, radicalization appears to develop on the rejection of democracy and of the national bond. It is an existential quest fed by psychological and social malaise, where vulnerable youth let themselves be easily indoctrinated. There is also an international aspect in the development of the foreign fighters. In 2012-13, many young people went to Syria primarily to fight alongside with different Islamist groups against the Syrian army and against the crimes of Bashar al-Assad's regime. Gaining international visibility, the Syrian drama has drawn young people, not always Muslims, towards the Islamic State. Today, they live with the direct aim of joining Daesh, and we sometimes see whole families leaving for Syria. The second observation concerns the diversity of vectors of radicalization and violence. According to the French Ministry of Interior, it is estimated that in France, 90% of those radicalized drift into terrorism via the internet. It was already mentioned. We must obviously address the role of internet. However, when looking at the profile of perpetrator of terrorist attacks or attempted attacks in France over the last 8 months, we should not underestimate the role of other vectors of radicalization, such as the penitentiary facilities where inmates can easily radicalize, or in the radical mosques. In this general context, what can we do? Several parliamentary reports have been published in France over the past 2 years on the subject of radicalization and of foreign fighters. Different measures, either preventive or repressive, have been devised and implemented. It is now essential to provide adequate follow-up of these measures and exchange experience among affected countries. What works, what doesn't work on a short, medium, or the long term. Our challenge is indeed to adapt our actions to a quickly evolving situation. A repressive mechanism is of course necessary, but we also need a prevention toolkit to stop the departure of radicalized youth towards the conflict zones, and a support mechanism taking charge of individuals after they have returned to the national territory. This personalized support and contention is undoubtedly an important challenge because it requires significant human and financial resources. We should focus on the prevention side with a twofold approach, preventing radicalization, and if this goal could not be fulfilled, preventing the departure and or the commitment of terrorist acts. First, the essential repressive component. In France, legislation has been reinforced, in particular with a law on terrorism, combat against terrorism, passed in November 2014, which provides, in particular, for administrative ban for entry on the French territory for foreigners and a prohibition to leave the national territory for French nationals if they are suspected of wanting to join Daesh. This law also allows the blocking of websites calling for terrorist acts. According to our statistics, there are around 2,370 pro-Daesh sites in the French language, which represents almost a quarter of all identified pro-Daesh sites. There are also about 41,000 jihadist propaganda tweets in French every day. In this area, a dedicated platform called Pharos was set up, allowing citizens to report illegal online content. This platform is closely monitored by experts of the security forces. In parallel, an agreement was signed a few months ago in April with internet operators concerning the removal from internet of radical content. A permanent contact group has been set up between the Ministry of Interior and these internet operators for this purpose. Meanwhile, the coordination has increased between the different French intelligence services whose powers have been expanded. This, of course, follow the debate on the balance between the protection of individual freedoms on one hand, and on the other hand, the need for providing security forces with the necessary tools, in particular, when it comes to interception of phone conversation or electronic messages. Next to the repressive aspects, there is a strong need to improve prevention. The first step of prevention consists in identifying radicalized young people or those likely to radicalize, and in providing support and assistance to their families. This is in France the role of the National Center of Assistance and Prevention of Radicalization, which is connected with the unit in charge of coordination of counter-terrorism. This phone call platform was set up in April 2014, last year, and is available to the families and relatives of radicalized youth. Its purpose, in addition to detection, is to help and provide advice to families. The platform includes Interior Ministry officials, psychologists, and is linked to the intelligence services and all ministerial departments that may be involved, including social services. As of the end of 2014, there had been around 1,600 reports via the platform. As there are today more than 1,300. 3,200. This mechanism is a major asset as it allows us to get precise information about reported individuals, those converted or not, French nationals or foreigners, having religious culture or not, male or female, their age or social background. Thanks to this tool, we can have a deeper knowledge of the various profiles of those radicalized and on the process of radicalization itself. Along with detection, French authorities aim at developing a counter-propaganda, it was also mentioned, against Daesh, in order not to leave the public space to radical discourse. This obviously requires the use of the internet and of social networks. A website, stopjihadism.gouv.fr, was set up in January this year in the aftermath of the Paris terrorist attacks, with the objective to dismantle the Daesh indoctrination efforts. There still is an ongoing debate on this website and its content, and about the best way to reach young people who by nature are suspicious of institutional or governmental communication. but the purpose is to gather, create, and spread content like testimonials, video of former radicals, or families of jihadists, or of victims of terrorism, or example of successful reintegration in order to counter the radical propaganda on the ground of objective facts. One key element in the fight against radicalization and in building an efficient counter-propaganda is obviously a deeper dialogue and cooperation with the representatives of the Muslim community. It is indeed essential to work with this community, in particular, in order to avoid any stigmatization as well as any parallels between Islam and terrorism. The French authorities remain very committed to this sensitive question. A Muslim National Association was recently established, the Association for Prevention of Violence and Radicalization. It is important that representatives of the Muslim community, in particular the clerics, be trained in accordance with our Republican values and that they may help develop a counter-propaganda speech based on theological arguments. Another question we need to address is the penitentiary system, since prisons have become a breeding ground for radicalization. A pilot project was set up in the French correctional facility aimed at creating a dedicated wing for people detained for criminal conspiracy to a terrorist enterprise in order to prevent the spreading of proselytism in prison. This solution, however, raises a number of questions because of the different degrees of radicalization among the inmates who had been isolated, the less radical ones being influenced by the more radical. It also requires the development of de-radicalization programs, the specific training of prison staff, but also of Muslim chaplains. Those different elements are now being addressed. The last element I would like to mention to prevent radicalization is the evolution of the educative system, because it is the principal vector of integration. One example, a new moral and civic education program is being implemented this year in the French schools with the recruitment of teachers for this specific purpose. Its objective is to strengthen the transmission of the Republican values. All the tools, as just mentioned, are centered on prevention, detection, and treatment of those identified before being radicalized. Our second challenge, of course, is the de-radicalization itself. And de-radicalization is not simply the reversal of radicalization. It is a process that encourages the reintegration of the individual into society. In order to ensure the monitoring of the returned foreign fighters, they must have been previously identified. Of course, this calls for close international cooperation and European cooperation in particular between internal security and intelligence services. This also requires an adequate exchange of data, especially on travelers. I'm thinking of the more than ever needed European passenger name record. Given the wide range of profiles shown by young radicals, the treatment of foreign fighters when they return must be individualized. The jihadists suspected to have committed acts of violence must face justice and, if convicted, imprisoned. Those returning disillusioned by the violence of Daesh and who did not participate in acts of violence must be compelled to undergo a deprogramming and a reintegration program. And those who return traumatized by war and violence will need psychosocial support and follow-up. A French parliamentary report published this year in June 2015, 2 months ago, defines a path to deal with the return of those radicals. The individual must first go through a monitoring carried out by internal security services, which assesses the profile and degrees of radicalization. Then a court decision would set an appropriate response. Prison for the most extreme cases with various levels of isolation according to their profile. De-radicalization centers for cases labeled as intermediate. French authorities are developing a project that could be operational in 2016, a so-called Center for Returnees, dedicated to people who are not facing criminal charges. And last, an open environment for least serious cases with individualized assistance, psychological support, and under strengthened supervision. The objective is to help these people to reintegrate society by enabling them to develop a personal and professional project. These are some of the measures that have been implemented in France or that are being considered for implementation. The debate is presently intense and tries to take into account a rapidly changing environment. French authorities follow with great interest the experiences carried out in other countries affected by radicalization and having to deal with returning foreign fighters, like, for example, the mentoring system which is being implemented in Denmark. The effort must be national, suited to our specific environment, but it must also be collective, benefiting from the best practices in that field. One would certainly be mistaken to think that we can succeed individually to fight such a global threat. Thank you very much.